Chapter 32. The Harpies by the Lake. There was still no sign of either Quinnigoff or Tanegi as Reyes re-emerged from the painting. He looked human, dressed in the clothing of a gentleman, the clothing he had obtained from Militia tucked in a neat bundle under his arm. Damothe and Violetta had also returned with him. They were now standing behind Reyes, each of them resting a hand lightly on the Harpy's shoulder, while the other hand rested lightly on the backs of horses. As soon as they had returned to the real world, they let their hands drop from Reyes' shoulders and concentrated on keeping their steeds under control. From the look on her face, Gagara had been getting quite concerned while she waited for them. She may have had company in the form of the two men who had stayed behind with her, but Reyes could imagine that it must have been hard to associate with people who thought of you as nothing but a foul monster. It took her a moment to recognise him in his human disguise, but then her face seemed to light up. She jumped eagerly down from her perch in the tree and then looked at her husband, tilting her head slightly to the left as if she was still a little uncertain. For a moment, Reyes wondered if maybe Gagara didn't recognise him after all. No, it wasn't that. She knew who he was all right. She had caught sight of the bundle of clothing tucked under his arm. Oh no. Sorry, sweetie, Reyes said, sticking to flourish for the benefit of the nearby humans. But unless you want to wait inside the painting... No, Gagara replied. I'll come with you. It's just that... She hesitated. Well, humans are so ugly. You're no oil painting yourself, one of the men who had stayed behind with Gagara commented. Then he addressed Violetta. Well, I am Thingy. Who is this? And what happened to the Harpy who entered the painting with you? Iab and Basmet have decided to stay behind in the painting and make what preparations they can for the rest of our people, Damothe explained. So, you want everyone to enter the painting? The man commented uncertainly. Damothe nodded. The king and queen really are in there. They have amassed a fair-sized army and are preparing, even now, to fight a rather major battle. They need us, and the painting is the easiest way to transport such an army, Reyes explained. Who are you? The man asked, looking right at Reyes. This is the Harpy, Violetta explained. He seems to be some kind of shape changer. So, you're really human? The man asked hopefully. No, Reyes said carefully. I'm afraid I'm really a Harpy. He showed his hammerstone ring to the man. I was brought up by humans and so have human loyalties. My ring is magical. It allows me to look human. It's a gift from Mangloss, the Damothe family mage. I think we can trust him, Damothe said. She had mounted a horse and was watching the conversation from the saddle. I'm not sure about the three with him, but Reyes hasn't lied to us yet. Even his wildest claims seem to be true. It's early in the day yet, Violetta decried, but I must admit, the king and queen, if that was who they truly were, seemed to trust him. They seemed to hold him in the highest regard. Let's cut to the chase, Reyes said, wanting to change the subject. Gagara and I will be accompanying Damothe and Violetta to the lake. You two are welcome to come along if you wish. We only have 2 horses, so you will have to walk, unless their ladyships are willing to travel double. Alternatively, Damothe suggested, you two could sit in the painting. If everything goes according to plan, everyone will be in there soon anyway. Plenty of food, Reyes coaxed. There's lots of human company, a comfortable place to rest, and a place where the elves will never find you. It's up to you. That or a 6-mile walk, Damothe said. One of the men looked at the painting, and then he looked at the other man and said, How bad can it be? It's not bad, Violetta said. The transition tickles a little, but that's it. But placing myself at the mercy of a Harpy, one of the men said, looking over at Reyes. Then again, it's hard to think of him as a Harpy when he looks like that. I'm tempted to risk it. There is no risk, Reyes replied. You can leave the painting any time you choose. Simply reach out a hand as if you were touching the surface of the painting from the wrong side. If it will help, hold a picture of yourself doing just that in your mind, then reverse the chant you used to enter. You will leave the painting and the ring both. Make sure Handsome isn't flying at the time. It could be quite a fool, Gagara said, and then she started to laugh. Are you okay, sweetie? Reyes asked, wondering what had prompted the laugh. It's just me, calling you handsome when you look like that, Gagara replied. Very well, one of the men commented, perhaps just a little hesitantly. I'll wait in the painting. He looked towards his partner. Come in, Ganimard. The man called Ganimard looked about himself. He looked up into the air and saw the 2 Harpies, Quinnigoff and Tanegi, as they circled before coming into land. This seemed to make up his mind for him. I guess so. Take my hand, Reyes said to them, and listen carefully to the words I say. Then you too will have the keys to the painting. Despite the fact that Reyes currently looked human, there was an awareness in the minds of the two men that Reyes was actually a Harpy. They hesitated to reach out and touch him, but eventually the man called Damothe took hold of Reyes' hand. Then Reyes leaned over the painting. He placed the palm of his free hand against it and then uttered the phrase clearly and slowly, so that the two humans could hear every word. Reyes didn't stay in the painting for long. He vanished from the forest and then reappeared less than 10 seconds later, having first ensured that his two passengers had made the transition safely. "All set?" Movialita asked. She was also sat on the back of her horse now. One of her beast's hooves was positioned perilously close to the makeshift frame that held the painting. "All set," Reyes agreed. He reached down again, and this time he put the painting into the ring. Then he looked over at Quinagoff and Tanegi. They had brought back a small handful of rabbits each. Reyes wasn't sure as to how many, but he counted at least 6. The creatures looked quite plump, extremely well fed in comparison to the animals they'd been able to procure to the north of the snow line. Quinagoff had quite a worried expression on her face as she asked, "Where's the chief?" Gagara pointed towards Reyes. "He's taken on a human aspect for a while." "Why?" Tanegi asked. "To make the humans more comfortable with us," Gagara replied. "Time for a bit of lunch," Reyes suggested. He tucked his clothing temporarily back into the ring and returned to his natural appearance in order to assure his two recently returned huntresses that it was indeed he. There was another reason for changing back. The food was likely to spit a little fat as it cooked, and Reyes would rather not get that on his clothing. "I'll pass, thanks," Damothe said. "I'm not feeling all that hungry." "Harpy prepared food," Movialita commented. "I'm sorry, it just doesn't appeal." Reyes laughed. "I hope you don't mind if we eat. We haven't had a good meal since we started our journey. In fact, this will be our first. Perhaps if you watch how we cook and prepare the food, you'll be able to see for yourself that our ways don't differ a great deal from yours." "Good to see you, my chief," Quinagoff commented as Reyes joined the other Harpies about the fire. "Hope you approve of our catch, boss," Tanegi added. Lunch took about an hour to cook and eat. When it was over, Reyes quickly changed back to his human self and put his clothing back on. Then he brought Gagara's ring out of the hammerstone and offered it to her. "It's time to get changed, sweetie." "Do I have to?" Gagara asked. "You don't have to," Reyes assured her. "If you prefer, you can wait in the painting with Quinagoff and Tanegi. I can go alone." "What did she say?" Quinagoff asked. Gagara smiled. "Fine. I'll get changed. I could use a hand with this human fabric covering though. I've only ever worn things like this once before, and—" "I'll help," Movialita offered. "Back when she was younger, I was always helping Damothe get dressed." "Move here," Damothe commented angrily, blushing. "You don't need to," Reyes commented. "I can help her." "No offence," Movialita said, "but you're male. What do you know about women's clothing? Besides, it's not seemly for a man to help a woman to dress." Reyes started, but he knew that Movialita was right. He could help Gagara to dress, but Movialita would likely do a much better job. Having handed the ring to his lovely wife, Reyes then stepped a short distance away in order to give Movialita and Gagara plenty of room. He found a tree to rest against. It felt strange resting against a tree and not feeling its bark against his wings or tail. Gagara glanced at the ring and then, with a resigned look on her face, she slipped it on her finger and immediately became human in appearance. She stood there in the middle of the forest, as naked as a newborn infant and without a speck of shame. She did sway a little as the new configuration of her toes made her feel a little unbalanced. "You shouldn't look," Damothe scolded Reyes. "Turn your back or close your eyes. A man shouldn't stare at a naked woman." "I see Gagara naked all the time," Reyes defended. "Not as a human you don't," Damothe replied sharply. "What you get up to as a Harpy is none of my affair. But if you're going to look human, you should at least try to act human." "Gagara is my wife," Reyes commented. But he did as Damothe requested anyway and turned his head to the side. He knew that under normal circumstances Gagara herself wouldn't mind, but then she so hated the human form that maybe she would prefer it if Reyes didn't look at her too much. "What's happening, boss?" It was Tanegi who spoke. She approached Reyes slowly. "Here it comes," Reyes thought to himself, the argument with his two bodyguards. Well, obviously they couldn't come along with him. They couldn't make themselves look human. Neither of them had even taken the time to learn flourish. Reyes looked directly at Tanegi and tried to wear an expression that would brook no argument. "Gagara and I are going to escort these two humans down towards the lake. It would be best if you sit inside the painting." Tanegi nodded. It seemed strange how readily she seemed to accept his words. Reyes wondered if it might just be because she'd been travelling with him for so long now that she knew it was a waste of time to argue. We won't sit in the painting. We can't keep an eye on you from there. Then keep your distance. Make it look as if you're just out for a lazy flight or something. Don't get any closer than you absolutely have to, unless we need help, Reyes told her. Reyes would rather they had agreed to sit in the painting. It might be safer for him to be in easy reach of his bodyguards, but it might also spook the humans who he was going to see. Reyes was about to tell Tanegi that he'd changed his mind that the two of them should travel in the painting after all, when Tanegi decided to speak. I saw a large lake to the east. Is that the one? I assume so, Reyes replied, his thoughts interrupted. The idea of insisting that his two bodyguards should sit in the painting cast from his mind. Reyes turned to Damothe and asked, Is this lake the one to the east of us? It is, Damothe replied. It's the largest lake in Flora, touches the borders of Reyes and Quince, as well as swallowing a fair amount of Borton. It's even large enough to have its own little island. More of a sandbank, really, Mauve commented, still concentrating on dressing Gagara. It's not large enough for more than a couple of wooden fishing shacks, and not really stable enough for those. To the east, Reyes conveyed to his bodyguards. He pointed to the east. Very well, Tanegi replied. Quinnigoff will go and keep an eye on you from above. We'll fly towards the small islands we saw, and warn you if we see anything we feel you should know about. Keep above bow height, Reyes suggested. There may be humans in that area, humans who might think you'll make an ideal target. We'll be careful, boss, Tanegi promised. Without another word, Quinnigoff and Tanegi took to the air and flew towards the east. They didn't fly all that far, but began to circle high in the sky, keeping their mail in sight. They're too visible, Damothe commented. Try to stay out of sight, Reyes shouted up to his huntresses. Try not to make it too obvious that you're following us. I still think we'd do better if you flew us most of the way, Damothe commented. There are likely to be elves in the woods looking to attack anything human. If the humans are as strong as you claim, then elven patrols are likely to be rare. Elves are callous towards their own people, but they're not stupid. If they know you're there, they'll come in force, Reyes told her. He raised his hand and summoned his horse from the hammerstone. Then they'll destroy you. Until that time, any elves we meet will be opportunists, lurking in the forest in the hope of making a name for themselves by grabbing those you sent out hunting. And those elves will be in the woods, Damothe voiced. Reyes mounted his horse and offered his hand towards the now dressed Gagara. Quinnigoff and Tanegi will keep an eye on them for us. We'll be fine. Gagara approached the horse slowly. You want me to ride that thing? I'm sure you don't want to walk, Reyes commented. Gagara let out a loud sigh, and then she hitched up her dress, complaining, How can Alicia wear these things? They're so uncomfortable. She reached up and took Reyes's hand, and a moment later she was sitting on the horse in front of Reyes. Her dress was far better suited for riding side saddle, and as a result seemed to ride up a bit as she sat across the horse. Very uncomfortable. Reyes shunted back a little in the saddle to give his wife a bit more room, and then he reached round her and took the reins. Are we ready? Ready, Mauve replied. Once she had finished aiding Gagara, she had immediately remounted her own horse. Ready, Damothe agreed. The easiest way to travel east would be to backtrack to the farmland and skirt the edges of the forest. It wasn't the best way, though. While the human slaves working the fields probably wouldn't give them a second look, they would be quite visible from the walls of the city and the elven guards watching the surrounding countryside. Admittedly, at that distance it would be hard to tell if the riders were elf or human, but Reyes wasn't sure it was worth the chance. Reyes turned his horse to the east and struck out into the trees themselves. This would be a much rougher road, but it would also be less likely for an elven patrol to chance upon them. It was a fairly uneventful trip to the lake. Quinnigoff and Tanegi, flying overhead, must have lost sight of Reyes and the others shortly after they began to cut through the trees, but they stayed close overhead, possibly following the sound that the horses were making as they brushed their way through the undergrowth. There was one minor incident. A hunting party of Harpies flew overhead, but despite the fact that they greatly outnumbered Reyes's two bodyguards, they kept their distance. After just under 2 hours of travelling east, they reached the lake with not a single elf in sight. They emerged from the edge of the forest, and their horses set hoof on the lake shore. There were parts of the lake visible from where Reyes sat upon his horse, where the trees grew right up to the very edge of the lake itself. In the past, though, this lake had been such a great source of fishing that large parts of the forest had been pushed back to make room for the casual angler. There were even a few small wooden buildings lining the edge of the lake, though it was unlikely that any of them had permanent residents anymore. Even now, there was a small group of humans on the shoreline, Most of them were looking up at the sky with concerned looks on their faces. Despite Reyes telling them to keep out of sight, Quinnigoff and Tanegi were quite visible in the sky overhead. They were lazily circling the sandbanks and were well beyond bow range. Not that it mattered. None of the humans standing on the shore of the lake were currently carrying a bow. If they could be said to be armed at all, it was with fishing rods. Except for the one man in the uniform of the militia, for he was also carrying a sword. When Reyes and Gagara, sharing a horse, emerged from the trees with Damothe and Movioletta just behind them, they immediately caught the attention of a few of the humans, but only for a fraction of a second. Then they glanced back up at the Harpies. Only one of the men on the shore gave the new arrivals anything more than a passing glance. "Damothe," the man greeted. Even as he spoke to the young girl, he kept looking back at the two airborne Harpies, his head flipping to her and back to them quickly. "It's good to see you. Word reached us that you've been captured and were up for execution." "Are we the first to return, Helltree?" Damothe asked, ignoring the comment. "You're the first," Helltree replied. "Why? Are there more?" "A few more," Damothe said. "I guess they're waiting until they're sure it's safe to return. Can we get someone to look after our horses for us?" "Really?" The man looked at Reyes appraisingly, and then he said, "It's good to have you back." Reyes dismounted from his horse and offered his hand to Gagara. She took it only too willingly, and once she was off the horse, she fell to her knees as if embracing the ground. "I never want to do that again." "Flourish, sweetie," Reyes whispered. "Speak flourish, just in case." Gagara nodded. "Sorry." She climbed to her feet and rested against Reyes for a moment. It felt to him as if her whole body was shaking. "I think I hate horses, except to eat." Reyes held Gagara tightly, and then he reached out with his ring hand and placed his palm lightly against the flanks of the horse. A moment later the horse was back in the ring. "Nice trick," the man who had been talking to Damothe said. He looked up at the sky. "Think you can make those Harpies disappear the same way, Mr. "Oh, forgive me," Damothe said. "This is Reyes Damothe, Knight of the Realm, and this is his wife. I'm afraid I didn't catch her name." Gagara started to say. "Gagrafina," Reyes said quickly. He shuddered as he spoke. Gagara was so obviously a Harpy name, but he wasn't sure that Gagrafina was any better. "This is my good friend Helltree," Damothe said. "Pleased to meet you," Helltree addressed Reyes. "Knight of the Realm, eh? We could certainly use someone like you." "Indeed," Reyes replied. Helltree looked back towards the Harpies. "And not a bow among us." Reyes stepped alongside Helltree and glanced up at his two bodyguards. "They're out of range anyway. Besides, I don't think they're doing any harm. It's not like they've tried to attack." "Perhaps not," Helltree replied calmly, "but they do seem to be watching us closely. We can't leave while they're there. They might discover the entrance to our caves." "Caves?" Reyes asked. "Caves," Gagara spat out in shock. "It's where we live," Damothe explained. "It's a vast network of underground tunnels and caverns that honeycomb the western shoreline of the lake. It's thought that some of the caves actually exist under the lake itself. It's certainly not unusual to find a few caves flooded occasionally. Most of the people of Lufton knew of these caves, and they made ideal hiding places when the elves arrived." "It used to be a mine," Helltree explained. "When the elves attacked, we sealed up the main entrance. Now there's only one way in, and if the elves should find it—" Reyes nodded. "Everyone would be trapped." "Can you do anything?" Damothe asked of Reyes, a glint in her eye. "What can I do?" Reyes replied with a shrug of his shoulders. "Well," Damothe said, "I just thought—" "Why don't I?" Gagara started. "No," Reyes cut her short. From the tone of her voice he had the feeling she was about to offer to fly up there and talk to them. "We'll wait," Helltree commented. "They'll have to get tired and land or leave sooner or later. Unless one of them flies off to get help," Movioletta commented. "Leave," Reyes hissed under his breath. "Get out of sight." Reyes had spoken so softly, though, that he doubted Quinnigoff or Tanegi would have heard him, considering the distance, even with their superior hearing. "Did you say something?" Helltree asked. Reyes shook his head and coughed. "Just a tickle in my throat. It's nothing." "Look," Gagara suggested. "I think maybe if I—" "No!" Reyes curtailed her quickly. Gagara glanced at her husband with a hurt expression on her face. Then she looked up at the two Harpies flying nearby, and this time, instead of waiting for permission, she shouted at them, "Why don't you just leave us alone?" Quinnigoff and Tanegi must have heard that. With Gagara's words translated for them by her medallion, they had no trouble understanding it either. They circled the sandbank a couple more times and then flew off to the north side of the lake, where they disappeared beyond the tree line. The man looked appreciatively at Gagara for a second. I'm sure they were about to leave anyway, Reyes commented. Heltry grinned and nodded. I expect that was it. We'll give them a few minutes to make sure they're gone. Reyes looked at Gagara. That was your big plan? To shout at them? Gagara grinned and nodded. Then, for the benefit of the humans nearby, she said, I didn't expect it to work. But the wink she added belied her comment. Reyes hugged Gagara tightly. I love you. Gagara held him tightly back and whispered gently in his ear, I'll wait here for you. I'm not going to enter any caves. But, Reyes said, you know what I'm like with enclosed spaces, Gagara told him. I'll stay here. Everything all right? Damothe asked. Fine, Reyes said. My wife won't be entering the caverns with us. She'd prefer to stay out here. As you wish, Heltry said. If you're staying, though, you'll need to come along sooner or later. 10 minutes passed, and with Quinnigoff and Tanegi evidently having gotten the message and keeping out of sight, Damothe and Heltry led Reyes to the entrance of the cave network.